Everyone, this video focuses on the Great Depression in Arkansas. I want to call your attention to a couple of things here. One is the picture. You can kind of see it. It's in the upper left corner behind the headline blur. That's the Hot Spring County Courthouse. It was one of many projects built by the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which was part of FDR's New Deal that we're going to talk about. The other two photos are from SAU archives. The one in the bottom left is a picture of Depression-era farmers, but the larger photo is one of Senators Joe T. Robinson and Hattie Caraway, who supported FDR's New Deal programs. In Arkansas along the Mississippi River, and it took several years to recover from that devastation. As we've discussed, the Gilded Age was simply golden looking on the surface. There were serious problems, especially in the state of Arkansas, which had not yet developed a consistently thriving economy. As the 1920s came to an end, it brought severe drought with it. So for the very people along the Delta who'd been hit hardest by the flood that they were just finally starting to recover from, the drought meant conditions were still not right to attempt a comeback yet. Then the market crashed, which led to the Great Depression. Here's a little more background information about the Great Depression itself. Herbert Hoover was president when the Great Depression started. He actually took office in March 1929 at a time when the U.S. seemed rather prosperous. The stock market crashed in October 1929, which set the stage for the Great Depression, set it in motion. That wasn't exactly all that caused the Great Depression. We'll look a little at that. The Great Depression was not Herbert Hoover's fault, although my grandmother would very much disagree. It did become his legacy, as my grandmother is a prime example for. She lived during the Great Depression, and she very much blamed it on Herbert Hoover. And upper-class Americans. A lot of Arkansans did not fall into those categories. So, back to the middle class and upper class Americans. They started investing in stocks that were not always secure. The Federal Reserve set interest rates artificially low to encourage more investment, because it would seem that investment in the market was good. The Federal Reserve lightened up some reserve requirements on the nation's largest banks. Money was in ample supply, but it was worthless. It wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, because there was no standard backing it, no gold or silver standard to back it. And it was not insured at the federal level. Also, we had speculators. The speculation was when investors bought into high-risk schemes, hoping for big payoffs. It's like going to the track and betting on a long shot. Americans who were still giddy over their potential fortunes that their speculation might bring to them. A brief downturn in the market on September 18, 1929, raised some eyebrows among the more seasoned investment bankers, leading some to predict an end to high stock values. But it really didn't do anything to change the whole system of investment. Even the collapse of the London Stock Exchange on September 20th really failed to fully curtail the optimism of American investors. After all, that was them. That's overseas. So when the New York Stock Exchange lost 11% of its value on October 24th, just a little over a month after the London Stock Exchange fell, that was referred to as Black Thursday, and key American investors sat up and really took notice at that point. In an effort to kind of prevent a much-feared panic, leading banks got together, including Chase National Bank, J.P. Morgan, and some others. They got together and purchased large amounts of stocks, including stocks in U.S. Steel, in order to keep the prices artificially high. But even faking the high price of stocks, didn't stop the crash. Nevertheless, in a radio address on Friday, Herbert Hoover, who was president, talked to the public and assured the American people that everything was going to be just fine. The market opened up 13% lower that following Monday. Panic definitely set in, and the market opened on Tuesday, October 29th with people shouting, "Sell, sell." Stockholders lost more than $14 billion in one day. There were rumors that people were flinging themselves out of high-rise windows because they had gone from being super rich to having absolutely nothing, bankrupt just in a moment's notice. There were fistfights on the trading floor, and banks started demanding repayment for the loans that they gave and threatened foreclosure, and that wiped out customers' savings if they had any at all. So naturally, this is going to make people not trust banks at all in the future, especially the very near future. This affected more than just investors. It affected anyone who had money in banks. Do you recognize this image? If you like the iconic holiday movie It's a Wonderful Life, this may look really familiar to you. This is a scene that features the bank run, when everyone rushed to the savings and loan or their banking institution to draw out all their money. The Nest.com explains the difference between a savings and loan and banks. A savings and loan institution focuses mostly on mortgages and consumer loans. They don't do business loans and that sort of thing. Commercial banks also issue mortgage loans, car loans, and all of that stuff, but they also make business and government loans. You can read more information about the difference between savings and loans and other financial institutions at the link below the picture if you'd like, which continued well into the 30s. In addition to the Federal Reserve's questionable policies and misguided at best banking practices, there were three primary reasons for the collapse of the stock market that were international woes, poor income distribution, and the psychology of public confidence. After World War I, both Americans' allies and the defeated nations of Germany and Austria contended with disastrous economies. The Allies owed a large amount of money to U.S. banks, which had advanced them money during the war effort. They weren't able to repay those debts, so the Allies looked to their reparations from Germany and Austria to help. But the economies of those countries were struggling too, so they couldn't pay their reparations, which meant the Allies couldn't pay their debts to us. It was just a big old losing circle. So poor income distribution among Americans also was a problem. A strong stock market relies on today's buyers becoming tomorrow's sellers, and therefore there's always got to be an influx of new buyers. There's got to be that continuation of wealth. In the 1920s, this was not the case. 80% of American families had virtually no savings, and only 0.5% to 1% of Americans controlled more than a third of the wealth in the country. So this scenario meant that there were no new buyers coming into the marketplace. In addition, the vast majority of Americans with limited savings lost their accounts as local banks closed, and likewise lost their jobs as investments in business and industry came to a screeching halt all of a sudden. So finally, the other most important factors in the crash, or the most important factor in the crash, was the contagion effect of panic. Look around and you can see that panic today. In the pandemic of 2020, the coronavirus, people started hoarding things: toilet paper, bleach, cleaning supplies, masks, gloves, those kinds of things. And that is a current modern day of the contagion effect of panic. For much of the 1920s, the public felt confident that the U.S. prosperity would continue forever, and so they felt that they were in the self-fulfilling cycle that the market would grow. But once that panic began, it spread just like the confidence had, and quickly the same cyclical results developed. People were worried that the market was going down, so they sold their stock, and the market continued to drop, which just made panic worse and worse. People to also hold strong. He declared that 1930 was going to be a great year for employment, and he knew that markets usually correct themselves. However, they didn't this time. So his hope wasn't necessarily misplaced. It It was just a very different time because the market did not correct from its downturn this time. And as the picture from It's a Wonderful Life showed, investors and the public rushed to banks to withdraw their money. Problem right then, but fundamentally, on the basics, everything was sound. It was going to be okay. But people stopped trusting banks at this point. They just couldn't trust them. So they started hiding any little bit of money they got at their home. This is when people start shoving money in the mattress or stuffing it in the mattress, hiding it in jars and buried in the backyard. Whatever they did, they hid their money. They did not trust banks anymore. Some of that came from the fact that banks called the loans on people that couldn't pay them. So they were foreclosed upon. Banks were kicking people out of their homes, which left people homeless. Not all banks did that. Some banks did try to work with people. Cities struggled to collect property tax because no one had money to pay property taxes. So cities lose money, homelessness grows, and then these shanty towns called Hoovervilles began to show up. Now they're called Hoovervilles after, you guessed it, the president that people are starting to hate because he's not offering any kind of relief. He just keeps saying, things are going to get better. It's going to be okay. But things were not okay. People were living in little shacks that they could make by propping up boxes or old boards. I think of a pallet home, something like that people were just putting together. And it's whole families that had to live like this. And these were called Hoovervilles after President Hoover. And the image here on the slide shows something called Hoover flags. So, when you say you're broke and you pull your pants pockets inside out to show that there's no money in them, that's called a Hoover flag. And those two things, Hoovervilles and Hoover flags, show just how much the general public detested Herbert Hoover. We've talked about the flood in 1927, and just as people were starting to almost get back on their feet from that, 1930 brought a drought. So they've got drought on top of the joblessness and the market crash. So 1930 is not a good year. And that bad year becomes a bad decade. It continues well into the 30s with another flood in 1937. So for one reason or another, even before the market crash, things were not good in Arkansas. Many farmers had to become tenant farmers. They didn't have property. There were Hoovervilles in Arkansas, and there was a camp for homeless people created near Forest City to deal with that sort of thing. With the president, no surprise that he was easily defeated in the election of 1932 by the man that my grandmother absolutely loves, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Franklin Roosevelt did not campaign on any specific ideas, but he did listen to people. We usually have party platforms. Trump's party platform was initially about immigration and building the wall. Those were something you heard from him frequently on the campaign trail. FDR didn't do that. He told people, I don't have the answers, but we've got to figure this out. We've got to work together to figure it out. So where Hoover seemed really disconnected from people, FDR immersed himself in the public and asked them what they needed. And sometimes when people suffer, what they really want is to be heard. They want to know that someone cares. And he presented himself as someone who cared. He also presented himself as someone that people could identify with because he also identified with hardship. He suffered from polio when he was in his 20s. And so it left him with a disability. And people associated that. He was afraid that people would look at him and see him as someone who was weak and not able to do the job of president. But people saw him as someone who overcame hardship, and they liked that. FDR, when he was elected, brought together a new Democratic coalition. And that included African Americans, minorities, and organized labor. And he told them up front, we're not sure what to do. We're going to take a trial and error approach. He told that to his cabinet. I don't have the answers, but let's try something, and if it doesn't work, we'll change and we'll try something else. If we have to change things twice a day, we're going to do it. And through doing that, he found ways to put relief directly into the hands of the American people. So there were several programs that were created through FDR's administration in order to put people to work. Now, these were not necessarily government handouts. These were job opportunities, because the idea was that if people worked for a fair wage and they worked for a living, they would be contributing to the needs of the community, which would also create a better situation. It would create a better citizen. It would create a better community. It would give people the help they needed when they needed it most. One of these programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, which built parks and trails and planted trees, worked to help soil erosion and that sort of thing. The CCC did have works in Arkansas, and some of those are actually at Lake Catherine State Park. There are some cabins there that were built by the CCC. And there's a website you can go to check all of the CCC creations in the state of Arkansas. Another one was the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, which built parks, schools, bridges, courthouses, and recreational facilities. That's the one that built the Hot Spring County Courthouse. The courthouse that was there before was absolutely gorgeous. It was built in the 1800s. I mean, it was an absolutely gorgeous Victorian-style courthouse, but they tore it down to make this modern one in the 30s. But there again, it provided jobs for people who needed work. The New Deal programs also included the National Youth Administration, and this put kids to work. Kids who were old enough to work had jobs making school repairs. They did things for the home ec classroom updates. It employed both boys and girls. Girls might do sewing and that sort of thing, like curtains for different buildings and all of that, decorating. So they put youth to work too, and also helped them be able to save for their education. The Public Works Administration, or PWA, created jobs for people, and the jobs also benefited the communities, the nations, and the states. Senators Hattie Caraway and Joe T. Robinson helped secure passage of New Deal programs, and that's a picture of them also on the cover for these slides. So the New Deal programs we talked about on the last slide definitely is not a comprehensive list of New Deal programs. Those are just a few, and a few that were in place in Arkansas. Another one that came about during FDR's second term was the Social Security Act, and we know Social Security is still in place today. It provides an old age pension plan, and then also disability coverage came into play at this time, providing money for the elderly or unemployed, disabled, that sort of thing. The Rural Electrification Administration, or REA, also came about during FDR's second term, which offered public utilities to rural areas. I don't know about Hot Spring County. I am familiar with Clark County, though. We do have an REA office in Clark County, and they get their power from Entergy, and then they sell it to REA customers. And they also, during FDR's second term, created a surplus commodities program to provide food to those who needed it, and that's what we know now as SNAP, or the food stamp program. That wraps up our look at the Great Depression in Arkansas. We've looked at the causes of the Great Depression, its effects on the state, the New Deal programs that brought relief, and some of those New Deal programs in Arkansas.